the session today will be looking at what I've been working on for the last 50 years, which is that each one of us can actually generate our own valid education. It's an explanation of your educational influence in your own learning and the learning of others, and the learning of the social formations in which we're working. So at the University of Worcester, what I want to do is to try to encourage you to, if you like, enhance the, it's almost like the footprint that you have in the global educational research community. And I'll try and show you ways in which you could do that, because we've been working with groups through the world. And this is Marie Huxtable, this is Kirsty, who is actually an alumni of the University of Worcester, and I want to...
Thank you, it feels good to be back. Yeah.
I want to draw out some of the implications of what Kirsty, also Surat Rawal, also Barnaby D'Souza, who got their doctorates from the University of Worcester about 20 years ago. Okay, and the relevance of the work and the values that they actually worked on 20 years ago, I'm going to try to show you why they're still highly relevant today. Okay, so that's me. If we just go around and, Kirsty, do you want to say just a few words about what you did?
Yeah, although it's been a long while. Yeah, I'm Kirti Bosekar, an alumni of Worcester. I graduated in 2006 with my PhD, and my PhD was, the title of my PhD was, "In what ways might I work towards improving my practice with street children in India, in Mumbai, through participatory action research?" And I have, and create my own living educational theory. So I have alluded to Jack's work a lot. Although I'm a bit rusty, and I have been out of academia for 20 years. I work in advertising now, so that's, but yeah, that's my background.
Marie?
Sorry, hi. Okay, I worked with Jack quite a bit since the last 20 odd years. Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Okay,
Okay, me. I'm Damon Lord. I'm doing the PGCE in Learning and Teaching Higher Education here at Worcester. I'm also doing a PhD at the University of Gloucestershire in English and Creative Writing. And I also work part-time here at Worcester, English language lecturer, and full-time in the IT department, setting up laptops and whatnot. So
okay.
a lot of hats.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
My name's Kate Howan. I'm a senior lecturer in primary education here at Worcester. I'm also alumni as well, so I've done a couple of courses here, including my teacher training. So I used to be a primary teacher before coming to work here as a lecturer in teacher training.
Good.
Senior lecturer in the secondary IOE, so I train predominantly PGCE secondary geographers. I'm really interested in this idea of developing living educational theory. My core golden thread, my ikigai, if you like, is work specifically on education in climate emergency, for which I've developed an enhancement module for our PGCE trainees. I'm the chair of the Sustainability Forum here, and I have a heartfelt desire to be working with educators in facing the huge challenges that are ahead with our children and preparing them to do so. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Marie brought, when you talk ikigai, did I hear that?
Yeah.
It's just that Marie actually integrated into her doctorate that whole notion, you know, of that ikigai coming from the Japanese. Yeah. But, okay. Would you like to?
I'm Alison Kington. I'm a professor in psychology of education here in the Institute of Education, and I lead the social psychology of education research group. So my research really is in the area of educational relationships, identities and interactions, mostly in classrooms.
Great. Okay.
Geoffrey Elliott, Professor of Post-Compulsory Education here at Worcester. Now part-time, formerly on the University Executive with responsibility for education partnerships, editor of the journal Research in Post-Compulsory Education, and most recently heavily involved in helping to edit the 2 books on social pedagogy, which the department has largely produced, authored, edited and produced.
Good, good.
And my name is Sean Bracken. I am the doctoral programme lead for the College of Education, Culture and Society, which kind of pulls in law, business, education and the humanities. But I'm also the coordinator for the Inclusion by Design research group, and ably assisted by my colleagues, some of my colleagues across the table. And we're primarily interested in the concepts of anticipatory inclusive design, so thinking about diversities in all of their formats, whether that's sociocultural, linguistic, disabilities, and their interface with learning, with teaching, and the notions of assessment as well, and the necessity to kind of rethink the whole notion of assessment, I think, in light of the growing diversities of student populations. So I was instrumental, I suppose, in inviting you along this evening and in perhaps exploring the potentials, I think, that may exist between universal design for learning and concepts of universal design with living educational theory. And I wish I had a kind of cool Japanese word that I could draw on.
Shrimin-yoku.
Oh.
Forest bathing.
Oh, okay. I'm right into that, actually. I was doing that a couple of days ago in Ireland, so there you go. So, but Jack, you're very, very welcome. And over to yourself to introduce yourself.
No, that was fine. Have we had everybody's introduction?
I'm so sorry that I'm late.
No,
Please
no.
accept my apologies. I'm Michelle Malamo. I work in the Department for Children and Families. I'm part of the IBD research group, and I'm passionate about accessibility in all its forms.
Okay.
Jack,
No.
can I just say, I'll keep the camera just on Jack, so if you don't want to be heard, don't say anything, but otherwise you won't be seen. I know some people feel uncomfortable being seen. Okay.
Okay, now I'm curious because I've been associated with the University of Worcester in terms of being a main examiner of some of the PhDs. From 20 years ago I did my first ones. And I've also been up for some award ceremonies. The most recent was last month with Swara Rawal, who was initiated into the College of Fellows of the University of Worcester, having got her MD, the D.Lit, rather, at the university earlier, as well as her PhD. Okay, so I also examined, again, 20 years ago, at the same time that Curti got her doctorate, Barnaby de Souza's doctorate. And Barnaby, he'd been working for 20 years with street children in Mumbai, and he then went to the Vatican and chairs the universities of Catholic, the Catholic universities section there. But he spent, the value space, which I could identify with, even though I'm not Catholic. The other person I just want to mention, because Curti, I'll show you how you can access this on the web, that actually the acknowledgements, in particular Swaroop and Curti, to the staff at the University of Worcester, Philip Chambers, these main names might not mean much to you if you haven't been here for years, but there was a guy called Tony Gay who actually started the Journal of Reflective Practice. There was Stephen Bigger, and Marie and I went to his funeral this year. Stephen's, in the beginning, he wrote a poem, and I put it, I'll show you how you can just access one of the lines of the poem, which is actually talking about the way in which the world has almost broken down in terms of its ethics and its values. But within this site where Stephen is buried, he's actually just trying to celebrate the values which gave meaning and purpose to his life. And Curti recognises what Stephen did with her doctorate, as well as Swaroop in hers, with the acknowledgements, because we often don't pay attention to the acknowledgements. And yet at the University of Worcester, you've got a history of really concerned and caring supervisors who've got tremendous abilities to help with the inquiries that the students undertake. And I'll just show you in a moment how you can access those resources. Okay?
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So thank you for
That's
making that legacy come alive. And I had meant to actually do that. And also to wish people a happy Diwali. And in light of Swaroop's contribution, indeed, but more widely, I think, as you've identified, to recognise that there's a continuity in relation to the work that has taken place here at the University of Worcester. And Alison is, you know, a significant advocate of that as well. They're kind of the torchbearers of that very strong values-based approach, very strong commitment to social justice, and very strong commitment to recognising diversities in all of its formats. So it's wonderful that you're enlivening that again. So thank you so much for, again, just reconnecting with our history, with our past, and recognising the necessity to do that.
I think it's really, it feels to me really crucial, this, you know, that you know, when I got my D.Lit, you know, behind me was the tomb of King John I, you know, from 1216, and the history of that, you know, with all the battles that went on for more freedom and more democracy, and also the dreadful condition that those barons then subjected to by King John, but that struggle historically of what we're all part of. Now, I'm just curious about whether any of you can point to the evidence that you've had an educational influence in anybody's learning. Okay, so if you'll just focus on that, because I had a tendency, attending the American Education Research Association, to ask key academics that question. And they got dreadfully embarrassed. You know, they thought it was an aggressive question, and it wasn't intended to be. I was genuinely interested in whether any of them could demonstrate that they had that evidence, yeah? That they were all talking theoretically, but I was interested in whether they'd actually used any of those theoretical ideas in evidence that they'd had an educational influence in the learning of their students or their social formation. Now, not one of them, and I mean this, not one of them, and these are senior academics, could answer the question. Not one of them could point to evidence that they'd had this educational influence in the learning of anybody. Now, as an educator, this seemed to me to be a real problem, because, you know, I got my own master's and my own doctorate, and then I was on that D.Lit, and the focus of all of those 50-odd years had been on trying to research the question, how do I improve my educational influence in my own learning and the learning of the students? Right? So I'll come back to this, just asking you, if you have that kind of evidence, and if not, would you be interested in actually researching your own practice in a way that you could justify your answer to that claim that yes, you have evidence, because it's related to values, you know, the values of human flourishing that you use as educators, but you use those as explanatory principles when it comes to your educational influence in your own learning and the learning of others. Now, I'll just mention this because during my master's degree, you know, I studied psychology, so I was in psychology of education. And at the same time, I was at the Institute, and there were people like Basil Bernstein, you know, Michael Young, others. And I was really entranced with what Richard Peters Paul has called the disciplines approach to educational theory. Now, in that approach, we had to master the conceptual frameworks and methods of validation of philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history. Okay, that was educational theory. And I accepted that until I started my own. It was in the psychology of education, my master's. I was a head of science. I studied with my kids their understanding of scientific awareness and understanding. And I could not explain my educational influence in their learning using any theories of psychology in any combination, okay, together with theories of philosophy, sociology, and history. So that made me question the whole basis of the disciplines approach to educational theory. I hope I'm making sense here. My vocation changed. I was very happy to be a science teacher. But having found that at the Institute of Education, that their whole view of educational theory seemed to me to be mistaken, I then applied and got a job at the University of Bath, where I spent all my professional life, to see if I could create a very different view of educational theory, which related to that question that I asked you. Do you have any evidence that you've had an educational influence in the learning of anybody? Okay? Do I make sense here? Mm-hmm. Now, my last two PhDs, because I'm at the University of Cumbria, just visiting professor, my last two PhDs went through this last year, and they were all about that living theory, that each, of those, there were over 32 of my other successfully completed doctorates from the University of Bath. They're all on the web, and they all answer that question. What evidence do you have that you've had an educational influence in the learning of your students or others or the social formation? Now, it's very different, when you were saying about the psychology. And I also, in terms of my awareness of the sociology, because Basil Bernstein was there, with Michael Young, and they had, they were loggerheads. I mean, it was fascinating to be part of those debates. But the theories that I actually studied very closely were largely the theories of communicative action by Jürgen Habermas. Now, I still use his theory of communicative action in relation to validity. So when I try to answer your question, for example, how are your explanations valid? How do you know they're valid? I still use Habermas's 4 criteria of social validity to strengthen the validity of my explanations. But I could not explain my educational influence using critical theory. Okay, I valued it enormously, but I always believe you should get at the cultural and the economic and political awareness of the context in which you're working. But it's not sufficient to explain your educational influence in the learning of your students or others. So let me just pause there and just ask whether or not that question about, do you have evidence? Where would I look for evidence that you've had this educational influence in your own learning and the learning of your students?
Could I ask you to define educational influence?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think it might be different for everyone.
The word influence, I made sure substitute impact. Okay, because my first degree was in physical sciences, and it was the logic of if you do this, then that will happen. As an educator, that was not how educational influence was established, because that always depended upon the creative responses of a student in terms of their own. So no matter what I did, I could never guarantee it was that. Yeah? So that's why it's influence. Now, the reason it's educational is that not all learning is educational. Historically, you just look, remember I was born in 1944, the Second World War was in full swing, and the hate that had been built up, in different cultures in terms of learning, made me question whether I needed to bring in values of human flourishing in relation to the learning. So what I mean by education and educational is that learning is taking place with values of human flourishing. So that is what I mean by something being educational. And it's different, you must remember this. You've got education research, which is the research carried out within the conceptual frameworks, methods of validation of those disciplines, like the philosophy, psychology, sociology, history. If it's going to be educational research, then it's really got to have the learning with values of human flourishing. And this is why, for me, that idea of you creating your own living educational theories, which is your explanation of your educational influence in your own learning and the learning of others and the learning of the social formation with values of human flourishing. And you use those values as explanatory principles. Am I okay so far? Now, this is where it's not being critical, but when I've talked with colleagues in different universities, they find that question very difficult to answer. Where can I see the evidence that you've had an educational influence in both your own learning but also the learning of your students, and also the learning of the social formation. Now, this is where I doubt if you, I'm delighted if you can direct me to where I can see that evidence. But what I want to do is to show you how you could join a global community of practitioners that are actually working on those questions.
Would you mind expanding that for us?
Sure.
What do you mean by the learning of the social formation? The learning of knowledge,
Yeah,
the learning of...
at the university back in 2000, okay, I was on Senate, and the students were actually forbidden for including data within their doctorates. Okay, it was not allowed. Another one was the use of I. Okay, now I was on a committee of Senate set up to look at the regulations governing research degrees. I'd spent 4 or 5 years battling this, in Senate and other places. I didn't get anywhere. But in this committee, all we did, we put forward a paragraph to Senate which said that the university regulations needed changing, and that from 2001 that students could be permitted to include e-data within their doctorates. Now what that did was actually open up the possibility of getting the digital visual data into the doctorates so that it could be analysed. Now that for me was an example of having an influence in the social formation. It was about the governance of the principles that govern the submission of research degrees.
Can I ask just a follow-up
Sure.
question as well in relation? You mentioned Habermas's the validity checks or whatever in relation to the lens that you use to self-reflect in relation to that influence that you may have generated. So can you explain what those might be, please?
Yeah, it's only a little text actually. It's about communication and the evolution of society. It's a very thin text. And he says, look, there are 4 criteria of social validity that we can use, literally to strengthen the validity of our claims to know something. And these are, and I think, a physical scientist like myself with his first degree can actually appreciate it. The first one was comprehensibility. That the very first thing you look at in your explanation is this comprehensible? The second criteria appeals to any positivist scientist, I think. It said, do you have sufficient evidence to justify the claim that you make? Okay, so if you're making a claim to know something, do you have sufficient evidence? That was his second criteria. Now, the third one is one that I like very much. But it recognises that wherever we're working, and you're at the University of Worcester, you will be influenced by your history and your culture. And Habermas is saying, look, you really do need to integrate within your explanation how the socio-cultural and socio-historical influences are influencing the explanation that you give. Okay, so that's the third one. And of course, when I was lecturing in South Africa, that context, you can just look at, if you're in America at the moment, there's one lecturer I'm working with in Florida, the pressures that they're under, they're not like pressures we're under very different pressures, but that's why that socio-cultural, the socio-historical influences on our explanations have got to come into the explanation. Now the fourth one is something that a positivist scientist doesn't have to bother with. And this is to do with what Habermas calls the authenticity of the explanation. And in living theory research, you bring the values, the ontological values you use to give meaning and purpose to your life, and am I living these as fully as I could, within the evidence of the explanation. And those are the 4 criteria that he uses to talk about the validity of an explanation. Okay?
Thank you. Really helpful.
Okay, well, I've got those, they're on the web, in terms of the application of those criteria. So when you're doing this work, if you do this work together, and you decide to use each other as part of a validation group, that would be helpful, I think, to enhance the validity of any claims that you might want to make in terms of the evidence of your educational influence in learning. Yeah, is there anything else before I go on and show you? You sure? Okay. Let me then show you where you might decide that your work is worthy of literally a global influence. Okay, so at the moment you're in the University of Worcester, a particular site, within the UK. Now, I was talking to Curtie just before I came in because I'd been fascinated by work because Curtie knows Swaroop, the PhDs were about the same time, 206, 206, 208, and both have demonstrated an influence in values to do with cultures very different to my own. I worked with a researcher from the University of Kathmandu in Nepal, and again, her values base, was very different to my own. Very influenced by Western traditions of, logic, of Aristotle and others, the positivist science. I did a lot of work in China in the early 2000s, and they brought in the interesting idea, the energy. Okay, now, if you look at our papers in our research journals, you'll find it very difficult to get anywhere near an embodied expression of energy. Right? But a Chinese culture that hasn't been distorted by our Western view would bring in energy. I had my last Ed.D. examination last Friday at the University of Nottingham. And they had two parts to their assessments for the Ed.D. One was to do with a visual portfolio, which wasn't assessed. The second was a 6,000 word assignment based on the kind of traditional work that I think we would all be used to. Are you okay with this? Now, that difference seems to me to be highly significant because Curtie in her doctorate actually stresses, it's not me,
We're all looking around.
I'm on mute.
could that be? Yes, I should be on mute as well. But anyway, those two ways of assessing, one visual, okay, the other traditional academic writing, which I imagine you've all done. Now, I've tried to persuade that group of academics at the University of Nottingham that their visual data actually carries embodied expressions of meaning. That it's the visual data that has got the embodied knowledge which you need to make public. To do it, you will need to have the words, yeah? But if you just try to communicate solely through words, you'll miss some of the essence that you communicate through your bodies. Now, I couldn't persuade them. My last one last Friday, I'd had 3 years trying, and they still can't go with it because it's such a risk. Yeah? So this is where Elliot Eisner, I always advise people go to Elliot Eisner's work, where he had the politics of educational knowledge, the problems and perils of alternative forms of data representation. And his presidential address to ARA focused on that. But it's something for you to bear in mind, I hope, that if you really want to get close to the values that you embody, I don't believe you'll be able to do it just through the traditional Western view of the academic text. You need the language, but it's got to be ostensive expression. Am I making sense? Ostensive, you use the visual data to point with the language to communicate your meaning. Because lexical definition, which is words defined in terms of other words, they're just not sufficient to communicate your meaning. Now, as I say, don't hesitate just to come back with anything you want me to raise. But I was going to go on now just to show you on the web how, if you decide that you'd like, if you like, to strengthen the global influence that your research groups and the Institute of Education could have, then I'll just try and show you where you might actually communicate together, and you could extend it to anybody that might be on, you know, the Teams meeting or your other groups, to encourage them to actually put in what we call their living posters, which I'll show you how you can. Yeah.
And I suppose that's what my question is. The examples, and it feels like they're coming up of kind of this substantive. What is it? What's that actually mean?
Yeah,
What does
sure.
it look like? What's the tangible of that?
Yeah. Okay. And as I say, please don't hesitate just to get the questions, so it can be as useful as it could be. Now, let me just. A lot of this, if you just remember the website, actionresearch.net, it really should be livingtheory.org, but I couldn't change it. You know, I did a lot of work on action research up to about 2000, and then it moved into living theory research. By that time, it was too late to change everything, you know, from this website. But this is the resource website that I use, and I just want to check if I can get. Just put this. Can I? Do we know? Oops. I don't know why that's gone that big. Wait a minute. Okay. Now, most of my writings, you know, when you think this has gone on for about 60 years, you know, there's an awful lot of material on this website. But I'll try and just draw your attention to something that, for example, here I'll click on this. But this is the presentation for today, where I go through the abstracts, the access to these resources that you could draw on, and especially with these living posters I'm going to try to show. But I'll also go through some of the doctorates that have used these ostensive forms of expression to communicate the meanings, the knowledge claims. Okay, but this one here is the actionresearch.net. And you'll find everything on here. And my very first paper, I'll show you how you can access this whole range of papers, was in 1967, and it was the very first paper I did at Newcastle University when I was on the PGCE course, and it was just called The Way to Professionalism in Education ? You know, so I was really fascinated by what constituted a profession, and that stayed with me in terms of professional learning and development. Now, if you go into this, let's just see if this will come up. Okay. Now, this is for today's session, which has got, as I say, just the resources that you could access. But I wanted to point to the funeral that I went to at Stephen Bigger earlier this year, because Stephen had had quite an influence in terms of the students like Kelly, like Swaroop and others, along with Philly. And he's buried in this beautiful spot in the countryside. You know, it's a wild part. It's really beautiful to see it. And in this spot, life goes on in a world that has lost its way. Now, I imagine every one of you looking at the news. You know, I can no longer really watch the news. You know, I used to be hooked on it. Whereas now, it just feels to me the world has lost its way. The values that I've really worked on to live as fully as I can, I think we need to reassert these. And I'll show you the groups around the world that are reasserting them and saying we're going to do this collectively, because we need, and I'll point why it's called a collective imaginary. But if you're going to get that universal design for learning, you know, into your work, I'll just see if this, as I say, this comes up. Can you see those principles, which Sean will correct me, you know, if I haven't got this right. But it seems to me you can all engage in something which feels universal. Now remember that I'm claiming that each one of you has got a unique living educational theory that you could generate and share. That universal principles are okay, that you can actually draw on theories and insights, as I did from Habermas I did it from Dewey, I've done it from a whole range of different theoreticians, but not one of them could explain my educational influence in my own learning and the learning of others. Now, you've got universal principles here, and Sean can correct me as I say. You've got the 4 principles of universal design for learning. First of all, what are you engaged in? What form of representation are you using? That's why I recommend Elliot Eisner's work on representation. You know, very powerful. He's got 4 papers in the book, all about data, you know, and its importance in terms of representation. Then this idea of actions, that it's like with the action research. You know, how do I improve? Which was Curtis' question about how do I improve? You know, the if you like, the quality of my influence with the adolescents. You know, it was in Mumbai with the street children. Yeah, so that idea of action. That do you take that responsibility for action within your context to try to help to enhance educational influences in learning? And this one, that idea of expressing, you know, now that felt to me to be really crucial. That was at the University of Bath. I managed to change, you know, along with colleagues in Senate, there were 4 of us on a working group. I managed to get the forms of expression to be used on research degrees modified so that they would include that sense of the embodied energy, which I hope you can feel from me, you know, as I'm presenting. You know, I feel energized. You actually evoke, you know, an energy in me because you are colleagues interested in professionalism and education, and that comes into how I express the beliefs that I have and try to bring them into my context. Now, on that website, with this form of presentation, you can actually access these resources which link to what you were asking, you know, about where might you go. So in these notes for the session, let me just go down to these. Now, I want you to be aware that this couple, Drew and Larson, claimed that we needed a new form of what they called collective imaginary. Okay? Now, that is something here. We cannot see the process of coming into being of our social reality. You know, yet our collective ability to create social reality is perhaps our most defining human capacity. This social reality is sometimes termed our collective imaginary. Now, in living educational theory research, this is why it's really important, if you like, to extend your influence using this notion of a collective imaginary. Yeah? Now, this is where you can access all the resources. That if you go into the URLs that are actually live in the presentation. Okay, so you've got homepage of living posters with guidance on their submission. Okay, so where you were asking that question about the forms of representation, this is how I would start with your colleagues and yourselves. You know, I would actually access these and then see how in your unique way you could submit your own living poster, hopefully from within a collective. At the University of Worcester, where you have research groups, you've got passionate interests, and you can actually submit just details of them to show what you're doing. And I'll just show you some of these that really are, I find, quite inspiring. So if you just click on that, and you can go into this one. I'll just reduce that a bit, if I can. So look.
And you said that these have been submitted. Some of these have been submitted for doctoral level vivas as well. Is that correct? Am I correct in?
They have been included within,
they've been included.
But I'll show you where you can access. There are over 50 living educational theory doctorates from different universities around the world that have already been awarded. Okay, so again, I'll show you where you can access those. But these are just to get, if you like, colleagues started together within a collective. Yeah? So this one here, if you go into the page, let me just see if I can bring it up. Now, you won't be able to read he's up here for the moment, but here you can have just some guidance if your colleagues need it on producing a living poster and submitting it, so we can actually post it on these areas. But you notice at the moment there is nothing from the Worcester, the research groups. And the Institute has got a group of research colleagues that you know there's a passion there. Okay, so you could go into any of those. The ones that I like at the moment, the Indonesian, this is on transformative educational research. Again, each one of them has got a clip where you can bring up their living posters, and they can actually show you what it is they're doing. Susie is helping to coordinate a group of these are all women academics. There are a few men there, but it's mainly dominated by women who, in terms of the values base, it's rather like in Afghanistan at the moment. You know, if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you know some of the, well, you want to have experienced it, but you know in terms of the difficulties that they're actually living under. Now, in Indonesia, that a lot of them culturally are suffering from gender imbalances, that there's a patriarchy at work that, you know, I do think we moved on from in this country years ago. And for them, it's full on in terms of what they're experiencing. And that comes over in their living posters. But that, as I say, I do think that one, you'll be able to get. The other one is on the education for development and sustainability. And I love this. Havisol Rahman is one of the conveners of this. But also from Rios Hauleda, when you look at the visual, you know, we talked about the ostensive expression of meaning, and you look at where he's working and the groups that he's working in terms of quite a lot of poverty, and yet these are the contexts in which his research is developing. This one, again, I'd just like to point to this about the Educational Journal of Living Theories. This is the community of the editorial board, the reviewers, and each one of those that you click on, you'll come to their living poster and what you're doing. And Marie's got hers there, I've got mine. Those are underneath. Leslie Wood in South Africa, she's doing fantastic work on living theory and community development. Are you okay with this? Yeah. Now,
Stephen is still included, I think, in the lower left-hand side there.
yeah,
Yeah. So his legacy lives.
that's right. I mean, Stephen, you know, this is why I want very much to stress the importance of the history and what has gone before, and the fact we're building on those values. And in fact, I've used Stephen's paper, you'll see, that he got published in eJolts about 18 months ago, just as an introduction to living educational theory research, just as Sean's book, and with others, is there for the introduction and the conclusion to get on the universal design for learning. But I do hope you'll get into Stephen's, because we build on what each other's done, and we can recognise, you know, the values that Stephen held in his supervision, which Curti experienced, you know, and Swaroop did. It's that values base within Worcester, which actually I think you can relate to and celebrate, and then take wider. Okay. You were just asking about the doctorates.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I'll just come out of that in terms of excuse me. That living poster one I do think is rather important in terms of the basis, you know, for getting started and encouraging your groups to really communicate what it is they're actually doing. You've got here the submission guidelines, the living posters. If I've got time, I'll come back to the Network Educational Lecture Research in Ireland, because that group of 5 women at the University of Limerick, they were being supervised by Jane McNish. Each one of them got their Living Educational Theory doctorate awarded from the University of Limerick about 2006 to 8. 4 of them have gone on from that time to generate what's called the Network Educational Action Research in Ireland. It's called NERI. and I'll show you how you can access that website, because their documents about their NERI meets and what they're looking at seem to me to something which you might find inspiring. And you'll see that, excuse me, in terms of how they then went for the Educational Studies Association of Ireland, that one of them, Marie Glenn, is now the president of that association. And again, her work and her values base you would, I think, recognise from what you're supporting within Worcester. But I just wanted to make sure that you actually had a look at the Indonesian one, NERI. You've also got, this is the one that Marie has just been working on, which gets you into an evolving treasure chest of resources.
I'd have to take exception to your map, though, in fairness.
I'll get rid of it.
Get on, that's Marie's fault. Right, now I'll show you the doctrines, because again, this is something I've been delighted with in terms of my own professional life. That, as I say, I went to the University of Bath in 1973, determined to try to develop a different understanding of educational theory. Okay, so this is the result of that professional life, University of Bath, whilst I was there, I had 32 successfully completed doctorates, all living theory doctorates, which are all on the web. Okay, and you get those here. That you get, they're all there, plus about another 18 from different universities around the world that have legitimated the living educational theories. I'll just see if I can enlarge that a bit. I'm just not sure of this system, but let's look. No. Oh.
It strikes me that just as you, sorry for
It's all
interrupting,
right. No, please.
but it strikes me as you, just as you're looking through these in preparation for this evening's event, I was very conscious of the significant growth around reflexive thematic analysis and that necessity to posit one's individual life experiences very much to the forefront of how one engages with the data of educational action research. So I think it's hugely timely, I think, your presentation in relation to providing a more holistic conceptualization, if
Sure.
you will, within which that kind of concept of reflexive thematic analysis could be utilized as a means for engaging with the data and very much positing the self and the values base of self as clearly articulating what one's actions are within that. So I just thought that, as I said, it's timely that we're revisiting this and re-engaging with it, because sometimes the concept of reflexive thematic analysis can sit outside of, erroneously I think, it can sit outside of people's wider perceptions of how best to engage with research.
Yeah, it is. Again, this is, for me, when I say complex,
Yeah.
It revolves around a problem between generalizability and what Michael Bassi, for example, which he called relatability. Okay? Now, if you go for some form of thematic analysis, what you can lose from a living educational theory perspective is the recognition that each one of you can actually generate your own valid explanation of your educational influence, and each one of you will use your unique constellation of values. Now, could you just hold on to that idea? Because if you try to impose any conceptual framework which could come out of that notion of thematic analysis, you can lose the understanding of the unique constellation of values that help you to construct your valid explanation of your educational influence. Now, that's not to say don't use insights from conceptual frameworks, but it is to say that if you try to use, for example, a thematic analysis, when you try to use your values as explanatory principles, you will tend to mask the embodied expression of your meanings. So, if you take the notion of a thematic analysis, you might decide, when I did the work with Peters and Hurst, you went through the 5 ethical principles, freedom, justice, consideration of interest, respect for persons. I don't know if any of you know this, but the text that Peters had, Ethics in Education, focused on that. The thematic analysis, we studied that, 2 years part-time study, going through his text, which was to use thematic analysis through conceptual analysis of those values. Yeah? Now, the problem with that is that I became very familiar with conceptual analysis. So I could tell you that punishment was the intentional infliction of pain by somebody in authority on somebody who'd broken a rule. And then I read Foucault's Discipline and Punishment with the first chapter on the killing of the regicide. Okay, now Foucault's analysis of punishment, compared with the analysis I've just given you, the two were totally different. So that idea that if you claim that you're living your value of care, just take that one, or compassion. I've got a lovely thesis on a passion for compassion on the web. That the thematic analysis actually emerges, now this is really important, and it comes out of the idea that Feyerabend talked about in his Against Method book, where he said, look, you'll only understand the meaning of freedom in the course of its emergence in practice. Now just think about that. It's not a lexical definition, in terms of words alone. You've got to bring your embodied expression of meaning, which you clarify over time through interaction with others. So this will be how each one of you generate a valid explanation of your own influence from your unique constellation of values. Some of you may have religious commitments where the values base is offered to you by a religion. Others, like myself, come from a humanistic perspective that I need to show you what I mean by freedom and justice, also democracy. I've got a whole range of values which are unique as a constellation that I bring into my explanations. Yes, sir.
So I'm hearing quite a lot that sounds familiar in terms of some notions that come from true grounded theory, emergent properties, for example, and also phenomenology, not IPM, but the proper stuff, where embodiment comes in, and I've got a PhD student at the moment who's doing something completely unique in educational research, which has only been done in psychiatry before now by 3 people, well 2 people, they've published 3 pieces, that's it, looking at phenomenological mixed methods, which as I say is new to education, where she has to go through, and it's been a painful experience just to get to the point where she's collecting data because it's so rule burdensome. It's bounded in going through embodiment and how this is sort of the me within the concepts, and you can't, it's all about subjectivity, not objectivity, so you have to take yourself out of everything as a researcher. So it feels like there are some familiar concepts within this as well that are grounded in other approaches. Would that be accurate?
Yes. Oh, very much so. In fact, if you look at what I'm just suggesting that you each might want to undertake, I think you would need to embrace, for example, a phenomenological stance. If you ask the question, how do I improve my educational influence? You know, if you ask that question, if you're interested in that in terms of your engagement. Now, the phenomenology, which I really like, I was very influenced by Merleau-Ponty's notion of phenomenology, that you start within the experience of the phenomena you're trying to understand. Okay? Start with it. So in my classrooms, I started with my experience of my pupils as I was trying to enable them to develop their scientific understanding. Now that had a phenomenological base. Now at the same time that I was starting on this, I was also working for my academic diploma and then the masters at the Institute, whereas phenomenology was coming into very much the sociologists, so like with Michael Young and others. Now, that notion of the grounded theory, okay, I'll show you where I've got a piece where I've gone through the insights that you can draw on from grounded theory, the phenomenology, the case study. You know, there are about 5 or 6 from the work of Creswell. And Creswell was saying, look, you've got to make a choice before you start your research. Right now, it's really interesting how he defines each one of the methods, and I like it very much indeed. But in living theory research, you don't make a choice of your method or methodology. What happens is, as you create your valid explanation, you're generating your own living theory methodology, because you only understand the question to which your thesis is an answer to at the end of your research. Now, it's actually really important, I think, to recognise that you use insights from a range of different theoretical perspectives. And I'll show you where I've tried to show, you know, the insights from phenomenology, grounded theory and others. But that's a really crucial question, I think, in relation to this kind of research. But I'll just show you how you can access those, okay, from Creswell, and then my responses from a living theory perspective. Go on, Marie.
Can I just ask, I think I heard you say that the practitioner has to take themselves out of the research.
The researcher.
Can I suggest as a psychologist, that's impossible.
The way that you look at the data is you, for this PMMR, which is what she's developing, you step outside and you look at it. So she's looking at children's friendships, at primary school children. So she has a very small number, but it's mixed method. So the phenomenology is applied to all data sources, not just the qualitative. And so there's a kind of, it's not a checklist, I don't want to call it a checklist, but there are things that she has to do. But I don't think I disagree with saying that from a psychological point of view you can't remove yourself. I think you can if need be. But I'm not a phenomenologist. That's what she's developing. I mean what she's done is mind-blowing philosophically and methodologically. Same with a previous student who's developed a new concept around grounded theory. Both of them feel, when I was supervising him as well, it was like being an Escher painting. You felt like you were going up the stairs and then found that you were at the bottom again. It was just, you know, a constant spiral where you couldn't get out. But I think that what they're doing is brilliant, and it's really original. But it just occurred to me when I saw the text before, emergent properties was something that, you know, we had to go through quite a lot with that particular thesis, and the embodiment again is something that Laura's had to really focus on and get right in terms of how you look at that in terms of when you're studying children, because the ways that a lot of texts define it, you couldn't do that. Ethically you couldn't do that. So it's been a real experience.
We could have an interesting conversation about this, but the very questions that you ask and what you look on as data that you bring to look at, you are influencing what it is that you're actually looking at,
Of course,
and the questions.
Yeah, of course.
So living educational theory research offered me, as an educational psychologist, a way of looking at those questions in a way that the traditional social science approach did not enable me to do, and to ask questions. Some of the questions I was asking at the time was to try and set up matched groups and etc., etc. And in a city the size of Birmingham, I could not come up with matched groups because, I don't know about you, I've not found anybody else like me. And that was a very, very important jump for me. But I think, Jack, you could say this much more coherently than I can ever manage.
I don't think so. I think
that's
your
really
question, about the Habermas criteria. I always preface those by an acknowledgement of Karl Popper's insight about intersubjectivity. Okay, so what he says is, look, if you want to get the objectivity and want to strengthen objectivity, recognise that it is grounded in intersubjective criticism. So in conversation and critical discourse, we strengthen the validity of what we're doing through what he calls the rational controls of critical discussion. So that's where I think that notion of the objectivity is linked to the notion of intersubjective criticism, because it enables you to show that your research has got validity that comes through what Popper calls a mutual rational control of critical discussion, whilst at the same time not losing connection with the fact that it is grounded in intersubjective criticism. Okay, but that's, if you're interested in this work, as I say, you'll see much of it now in this resource section of the website, and that point there about the really crucial thing, about these different methodologies. If you're interested in phenomenology, interested in case study, you're interested in action research. Now, each one of those, like the grounded theory, for example, if you go into the assumptions of the grounded theory, you come up with some kind of generalizability, okay? Now, in living educational theory, you don't. It's actually relatability. The fact that each of these theses will have something, I believe, that will resonate with you and that you'll be able to draw on. But it's not a direct application of the methods or the knowledge that's been generated. Now, this one here, this particular section of the site has got what I was saying to you about the Creswell and how each methodology is gone through. It's the last item on this paper. This is it, the notes, that one there at the bottom. And it's saying justifying, your creation of a living theory methodology, and it goes through Creswell's ideas, narrative research, phenomenology, grounded theory, ethnography, case studies, Ellis and Bochner's ideas on autoethnography, Whitehead and McLiff's idea on action research and living theories, Tight's ideas on phenomenography. But I think you'd find there just an engagement, a critical engagement with each of those approaches to research to try to explain why each one, if you like, is different to what you create as a living educational theorist. You create your own methodology as you generate your valid explanation of your educational influence. But again, I think you must write. My email is on, that phone page. And if you've got any other questions or you want to make any responses, as I say, please do. Because this gives Mary and I the chance, to continue a conversation. And if, as I say, what I'd really love to happen is for you to think, at Worcester, you've got these combined, the research groups that you've got. And they might be interested in sharing the creation, first of all, of their living posters. For example, so that we've got something that's got under the University of Worcester, the research groups, or the Institute of Education, which shows, if you go into those living posters, it enables you to just make contact with other groups to show what you're doing.
I think it would resonate particularly as well with the social psychology group, I believe, wasn't it?
Social pedagogy.
Or social pedagogy, I do apologise.
Absolutely.
There's something left in that question.
Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. Number one. Somebody left the number one down behind. But yeah, I mean, and that kind of concept of the social pedagogy very much being based in relation to transformation of self and transformation of wider marginalised groups within society. I think this is certainly something that would resonate.
And
Jeffrey.
making research useful and meaningful to
Yeah.
the people who are traditionally thought of as the subjects of
Yeah.
research. They're actually not the subjects of research. You know, they are the research.
Yeah.
Research doesn't exist without them, and so it's giving respect to them, which is of course an ethical question as well. But this method of sharing our work, I think, would be extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Can I just add, the living posters are not meant to be academic posters.
No.
They're a way of actually sharing. It's
Sharing
like being,
of work,
it's like being in you go to a conference and you stood next to somebody in a coffee queue, and you very quickly have a conversation. You think, oh yeah, I want further conversations with you. Might not go anywhere, but we'll have a further one later. And that's the presence that you can have, and you can continue to have. That's why people send us new ones. So, for instance, Swaroop has sent us a number of the years. I don't delete anything. So, as one is archived, there's a link to what's gone before. And because you continue to have a presence, as you were saying, Stephen's still very much part of this journey, even though he is physically no longer here. And that's the case with some of these people I've not had any contact with for years, but they've still got a presence. Well, the challenge is how to put this in a way that is accessible without being totally overwhelming. So if you wanted to have your presence in a Worcester group, it's not to say that you have to dance to a Worcester tune, but it's a way of people understanding your context, and as your practice changes, and if it doesn't change, I'm wondering what the hell's going on, but your context is also changing. So that also you start to look at. People use different things like journaling. This is another way of doing it that makes it very accessible. And finding the images, for me, has been fascinating because it can take you ages to find an image that communicates, along with a few words of text, what it is that you're trying to say about your practice so that people can understand. Does that make any sense to you?
It sounds like a beautiful process in which you get to be creative and really connect to your inner way of being in the classroom, in your practice.
And there's no right or wrong way. Some people say, oh, I can't possibly do something as beautiful and creative as that. Other people have just got a page of text. So whatever works for you, that you feel communicates, and then the next one you do might be different, but that's part of you. We're all living, we're all changing, and it's actually to try and hold that. And that, for me, is one of the things about living educational theory research, is you start to look into your practice to try and understand the values that give meaning and purpose to what I'm doing, why I'm doing what, which is why, as an educational psychologist, I've been struggling for years to understand what is educational about educational psychology, what's the difference I'm really wanting to make to these kids' lives. It's not just about whether I can improve their test scores. It's something to do with them living a satisfying, productive, worthwhile life and helping others do so too, which makes it educational. And that's evolving. And there's a lovely paper which we must put up there, Sanja's in Croatian. And I remember her presenting this a number of years back now. And she showed us a video, first of all, and said, can you see me living, what values do you see me living? And the classroom was set out, and she was working with Moira Laidlaw and Branko Bogner. And she said, well, I felt that I should be living my democratic values. And she looked at what the context actually was she was supposed to be teaching the kiddies to speak English in Croatia. And she realises that actually contradicted the very values that she was talking about. Then she realised, and I thought she was so brave, to actually challenge, having seen her own values, to actually challenge these and say, actually, no, I do actually think that I should be trying to bring a democracy into my pedagogy and way of being. So she was brave enough to say, what I thought I was doing, I actually now realise I didn't want to do, because I wanted my classroom, thank you very much, for you to sit there and do what you're told. And then she said, no, I've got that wrong. I was just saying that to please my supervisors. But now I'm challenging myself, and now my meaning of those values is democratic. And the way she changed her pedagogy, which, perversely enough, actually meant the kids learnt to speak English a lot more, because all of them were speaking English. And they demanded other people, including Branko, when he came into the classroom, that he spoke English too, because that's what they had decided. So, of course, they practised English a lot more.
Yeah.
So it's a heart of living educational theory research that you couldn't get to with, I haven't found, you might well have found, but I haven't found any other methodology that did this for me.
What I think is...
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
not at all. It's just that this, again, I think you might find difficult, and it is. It's something, when I was given the inspectorate, gave me, as a head of science, they gave me one of the first video cameras in London to experiment. Yeah? So I turned it on myself, first of all, in the class. I thought I'd got inquiry learning going. Right? Now, for me, it was intensely embarrassing to look at myself and see that I was giving the kids the questions, no matter how subtly, and that I was not doing what I believed I was doing. Yeah? Now, that immediately evoked my imagination of what the hell do I do? You know,
Leading.
how do I improve what I'm doing?
Leading.
Yeah. Now, that led me to embrace the notion of being a living contradiction.
Mm.
Okay, so,
Oh.
yeah?
No. Just the one of the colleagues who couldn't be here earlier on was speaking precisely about that just before you arrived.
Right.
So
Okay.
he'll be delighted.
Yeah.
This is particularly for him.
Yeah, it's something that, you know, I learned because I was given one of those first cameras. And I know Curtis was saying how embarrassed she feels by getting my camera on her. Yeah? Because I had that early experience, so that was in 1972, I genuinely lost that kind of inhibition because the camera and what it showed me was so important to me. You know? And I got over that embarrassment. It was deeply embarrassing to see that I was doing the opposite of what I believed I was doing. But that led me to the living contradiction. The idea, in the question, how do I improve it? The I exists as a living contradiction. Now, I just want to mention that because it challenges, literally, the Western epistemology based on the logic of Aristotle. If you go into almost all of the journals that are published at the moment, you'll find they all obey the Aristotelian law of contradiction, which you can't have two mutually exclusive opposite statements which are true simultaneously. Yet I can look at myself in the video and say, I hold certain values, and at the same time I'm denying them. Therefore, you need a different logic. And that's why the dialectical logic, with its emphasis on contradiction as its nucleus, is often, I find, a more appropriate kind of logic, you know, than the traditional one that academics use in their papers. But I did want just to highlight the importance of embracing that experience of being a living contradiction. Not seeing it as a negative at all, because it evokes those responses about what do I do to improve my practice. You know, I've seen something that needs improving. Now, and I will come to an end and ask if there are any more questions, but at the end of the presentation that I put on the web for you, you know, in that What's New section of my website, at the end, you've just got these recent publications. Thanks for coming.
I'm loving it. Super.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye. But these here, I imagine you're all suffering, as I used to suffer, the Research Excellence Framework. It's part of this.
Alison's suffering.
You're suffering, yeah. Now, these are the kind of papers that we've had published recently that could easily be put in for that Research Excellence Framework, like at the University of Cambridge. And they all come out of the living theory. This one, Professional Development in Education. This one in the Journal of Transformative Praxis. And that one there, I gave the keynote to their conference last year. And it really does allow you to take the individual, where you were saying about how this approach, really does appeal. You can bring that into a global context, with that relatability into the local. And that's what we did there, as a transformative practice, but it doesn't just have a significance locally, like at Worcester. You can actually embrace and communicate with other groups that we've now working with, literally in Indonesia, in China, we've got some lovely groups. So don't just think, your individual context, don't be put off if people say it's just anecdotal, it's subjective. You can demonstrate all of these kind of qualities that make it rigorous and valid research. So that one there on the transformative practice, this was our latest book. It brings in the epistemology, that it shows how this has got a very grounding in theories of knowledge. So if you want to develop your own living educational theory, you might find that book helpful. And this one here I'm really pleased with. This was in the Irish Educational Studies, about why a focus on what is educational matters so much in reconstructing education, because you'll still, I think, be subjected to the power of education researchers. Those are people within the disciplines, and it's not denying, I'm not denying the value of some of those insights. But when they dominate what counts as educational, it's that where I actually have an issue with them. I demonstrate how I use insights from education research, but at the same time, I want to sustain what I mean by educational. Are we okay with that? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I just say, sorry.
Do.
If you're sitting here thinking, oh, that's all very well for him, he's no longer in these constraints of having to do the ref and all those other things, and hitting all your targets and so on. One of the things about living educational theory research is it gives me hope. I guess that I don't think you'd be sat here unless you actually wanted to make a difference in the world that's actually meaningful. And where you experience your values contradicted myself, but in the very context. We never live in an ideal world. And Jack's got a number of, I've seen him do this. So when he was running the masters, we had one of the teachers said, yeah, okay, Jack, I'll do this after the SATs. I can't be looking at my practice, the educational input. It's part of the world. Okay, so how do you take that as an opportunity to actually see how can you live those educational values as fully as you can and have an educational difference in the learning of those children while you're helping them to learn to pass the SATs tests. So it's very much grounded in a real world context. It's not of an ideal world. It's not an idealised world. So I find some of the ones I find most inspiring actually are the ones on the masters, if you have a look at the masters ones, because for instance, one of the teachers, Amy Skews, is the one who was talking about not being able to do it because of the SATs. You've got Claire Formby, who's one of the master's units. And she wanted the children to be able to take control of their own learning. And it was at a time when they were being told what to do, when to do it, and you had that literacy hour clock. I don't know whether you guys are old enough to remember that. So there was a limit to what she could do. But once a week, she had a lunchtime session with her, and they were 7-year-olds, I think 6, 7-year-olds at the time, when they actually had an opportunity to investigate something of their interest in their own way, in a disciplined manner. 2 years later, Jack and I were sat in the foyer waiting to talk with a staff meeting, and a couple of kids who had been part of this saw us there and said, oh, what are you doing here? They said, well, we're going to talk to the staff. They wanted to talk to the staff, thank you very much. So Claire invited them along, and they told the staff what difference that had made. And that was half an hour for lunchtimes once a week of about a term. And these kids have remembered 2 years later. And the confidence with which they spoke was stunning. So that's why it gives me hope that whatever your context, no matter how small, the difference you think you can make, you can do something. And that comes from living educational theory research for me. Actually looking at what difference am I trying to make. And I never live in an ideal world. I think it'd be really boring. But but no matter how small, it's saying, okay, I'm responsible for what I'm doing. That bit I can actually do something about.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it was interesting.
It's the difference it's made. I've seen it make to so many people.
But you asked, I think, you were saying when we were coming up, that this is broader than, for example, what we were doing in schools.
Yes.
You know, that when you go back and you've got your research groups, you know, like with the social pedagogy, yeah, that one of the PhDs there, so lovely, and the title is just Passion for Compassion, okay? And it contains some of the visual evidence. It's a husband of 50 years working with his wife for 50 years who has Alzheimer's. And the Passion for Compassion, the examiners had a look at the video that was in the thesis, and they understood from what the PhD researcher was showing them her meaning of a passion for compassion, you know, from the visual. Now, this goes out of the classroom, and you'll find on those PhDs we've got, you know, an engineer who worked on the petroleum, the gas fields, you know, with the huge drilling. It's about safety. You know, we've got a whole different range of people that have done. Not only within the classrooms, you know, it's not only higher education in the sense of a classroom with the children. These are engaged, you know, it's your point about universal design for learning. The people that have got their professional questions, which are grounded in a really wide range of professional contexts. So, you know, I do hope you'll find my email on there. If you get to me, you can get to Maria's.
You're the bodyguard.
Yeah.
Get to Marie.
That's right.
Jack, it's really interesting because I feel like I can place myself in the poster. I feel like I can. I mean, I almost want to go home and do it, is that sort of thing, because for me, I'm dyslexic, and the energy to be able to express myself in a written medium is really difficult, and it takes time, and I feel like I've always had to prove myself in that medium in this world of academia. And I've, you know, I think I've done okay in that, but actually when you were speaking I was thinking about, in my masters, I was supervised by someone called Stuart Esther, and he's phenomenal. He was a phenomenal writer in the play world, and that's my sort of specialism. And I didn't understand some of the stuff he was saying to me at that time, but now sitting back and realising that he had a massive influence in the way I teach, in the way I am, the way I'm passionate about things, and so just as an exercise for me to do a living poster will re-establish myself. Does that make sense? In this world of academia. So for me, I think that's been something like, I'm a journal writer anyway. I like to write journaling, but this is really something that I feel I can connect with.
Yeah. Now, not to re-establish, but this could be an original contribution.
Yes.
Yeah. to your field, because you could be showing how the visual communicate the meanings of the embodied.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that could be a really significant contribution. So it'd be lovely if you would just send my emails on that, actionresearch.net at the bottom. You send it what I do, I then send them to Marie. Marie works on them. I then actually put them on the web with the living posters. Okay, so please do that. And the more that you can encourage your colleagues, I think Kurt is going to do 1 week update hours, but it allows you to, as I say, just feel that not only with your colleagues in Worcester, but there are, as I say, those global connections now that I think you will enjoy, feeling that these people with these values are actually doing something that you actually share in terms of what we call the values of human flourishing. So that would be lovely if you would do that.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you for inspiring me.
Oh, it really is a delight to be here. So is that it?
I think that's it, yeah. I'll perhaps finish up with a couple of words of acknowledgement and thanks. And maybe I started by wishing everybody a happy Diwali. So I will use my very limited Hindi and say ek.
Ek, okay.
Yeah, ek.
Do.
Ek, do. And
One more.
3, 4, 5, I think. Because it's actually very similar to Irish.
It is.
Yeah.
You're right.
In terms of its Indo-European
Yes.
roots.
Yeah.
But to kind of make that connection, and in one, thinking about, you had mentioned earlier on about your colleague in the United States and saying in pluribus unum, in many we are one. That we have this element of universality, but we have this element of divisibility and the importance of that divisibility and the centrality of the individual in reflecting on their own value base. So thank you so much, I think, for inspiring us in relation to that. But also to thank you for dusting off that heritage that is part of who we are in Worcester, and that great values-based approach that you've said has inspired research here for such a long time. So thanks for re-energizing us in relation to that. So it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure, and I'd just like to thank you again for your really erudite and very well informed kind of perspectives that you've shared with us this evening. And thanks for inspiring us, I think, to move forward in terms of our own living educational theories. So once again, thank you so much. And I've just got a very small gift. Unfortunately, I don't have een, do, 3. Unfortunately, I don't have 3 copies, but just the one. It's on learner voices, perspectives, and positionings. And this is from. There's a foreword by the former head of the Department for Education and Inclusion, Professor Richard Woolley, and he's another dear colleague who again kind of took Stephen Bigger's heritage, I think, very much to inspire his practices. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. Wonderful pleasure.
And thank you to you all. That has been a delight. So thank you. Yes, good.
Please take a cake or a croissant for the road, or
Yes,
balance
will
diet,
do.
one in each hand.
Good. Will do. Thank you.
Thank your son for taking care of your mom.